Well, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I just want a short introduction for me. I'm absolutely thrilled to have the participants in relation to this session, but just to let you know that this session is part of a joint project that has been conceived by the Lannan Center at Georgetown University in the physical form of Aminatta Forna here, and also Beyond Conflict in the physical form of Tim Phillips, and of course Beyond Borders. And the project is about reimagining the American narrative, and it's been running since March. There's been a series of events and Zoom conferences and some physical conferences planned where we are looking at the American narrative. And in particular, our contribution, particularly in March, was to look at how Americans are seen by others on the kind of Rabbi Burns principle of give us the power to see how others see us. And we think that this is a very important contribution to the American dialogue that's going on at the moment about their own culture, their own ethics and values, and some of the culture wars. So I just wanted to give you that background, and with that, hand you over to the wonderful Jim Naughtie.
Thanks very much, Mark. No, I don't need that. Welcome, folks. I should say that people have been on a poetry walk, and they will want to come in at the back. So if you hear kind of dribbling people arriving, that's what it is. It's not that they don't want to be here, it's that they've been doing something else. You're all very welcome.
It's not the Colombian army taking over.
This is a stellar panel. I won't waste much time. Aminatta Forna, writer of fiction and non-fiction, professor at Georgetown, is obviously here on my right. Tim Phillips of Beyond Conflicts, for many decades, several decades, is here. And Oscar Guardiola-Rivera, who, I could describe as a Colombian philosopher, professor at Birkbeck, University of London, in all kinds of ways, but deeply involved in questions of law and justice and human rights and all the rest of it. They're a wonderful panel. The word exceptionalism is mentioned in the rubric for this session, American exceptionalism. The idea embedded in the Declaration of Independence, and we're going to be joined, hang on, I've just seen, Razia Iqbal, who's my BBC colleague, without whom, as Mark was saying to me earlier, no Beyond Borders weekend would be possible, or at least complete. Razia is going to join us, and what we've done, because she's the only one who's going to be joining us remotely, although she's going to be watching the whole thing, and you can see her there. Razia is going to come in towards the end, and she's going to distill all the stuff that you've said and kind of feed it back to us. Razia, hi. I look at you through here, which is slightly disconcerting because they look at you through there. Welcome. Good to see you. I want to begin by asking you, Aminatta, what American exceptionalism means to you.
Hi, everybody, and thanks so much for having me. I'm pleased to see you here again. A little bit about me. I've lived in many countries in the world as a consequence of my childhood, my parents, and then also adult decisions. And I currently live in the United States. I've lived there 3 times. This is the longest period I've lived there, in the DC area. And so if you ask what is American exceptionalism up to anybody in particular, the question is who is looking, right? Who are you asking and who's looking? And I remember on this particular occasion when I moved to the States, an American man said to me, well, you colonials. And I said, what? And he said, you colonials. And now I'm Scottish and Sierra Leonean. The last thing I would describe myself as a colonial. I said, but aren't you the colonials? You're the colonials. So if you come from a colonized country, what America looks like to me is a successful settler state. right? It's a colonized country, it's a successful settler state. But that's not how Americans see themselves. They look at their history, they look at their origins, they have a foundation myth, and the foundation myth is about, is based on the idea that they are special, exceptional, and no country has a history that is in any way similar. What's really fascinating about it is how deep and enduring this idea. I mean, all countries have their foundation myths, right? They all tell stories about themselves and bolster the collective ego. But what is so fascinating about the idea of American exceptionalism is how enduring it is.
Thank you for that. You make the point that it's embedded in the Declaration of Independence, it's embedded in a sense in the Constitution, the idea that it's different. And so is the idea that this is still an experiment. Tim, let me ask you, as an American, how you think the idea of exceptionalism, not just that it's a peculiar kind of country because it was set up in a certain way, but that it's therefore better and raised to a higher level, has developed in the last, let's say, post-Reagan period?
Well, it's great to be here with everybody and see a lot of friends in the audience. So I did a little research to remind myself of the history of the notion of American exceptionalism. And actually, the first three people who really coined that phrase were not from the United States. One of them was John Winthrop, who was an early Puritan, came from England. And when he got off the boat and came to what is now Boston, he talked about building a shining city upon a hill, which is really the first time in around 1631 that this notion of there's something special about this place, something
No accident
aspirational.
that that was in Reagan's inaugural speech.
Yeah,
his first
Peggy
one.
Noonan grabbed that.
Yeah.
And then when John F. Kennedy won the presidency, he went to the state capitol in Boston and quoted that, John Winthrop. And then, of course, de Tocqueville, when he was traveling around the American colonies, referenced there was something special about the groups of people that are populating this colony. But the first person who actually coined American exceptionalism was Joseph Stalin in the 1920s, referring to the American Communist Party, where the leader was saying, well, we're different here. We can't have the same revolutionary process that you've had in the Soviet Union and other countries. And Stalin, probably if he had his hands on this guy, would have killed him, said, what is this notion of American exceptionalism? And so I would say that in my experience as an American, particularly one who's worked abroad for 30 years, not as long as Jim suggested, but the last 30 years.
Steady on.
That I often heard the phrase American exceptionalism, not within the United States of people who just lived a domestic life, but in terms of how the US engages with the world. And what I have found over the last 20 years is the idea of American exceptionalism has been deeply eroded among Americans. And it's really the way they would often talk about is the American dream. What is the future? What makes us special? The thing, that you can lift yourself up from the bootstraps. You can do many things, right? And that's been deeply eroded because we've never really built a truly inclusive but exceptional democracy. So yes, it's been aspirational, but it hasn't really been achieved. And when it was achieved at the end of the Second World War, actually, is when there was more of a middle class growing. I would argue that it's been, the notion there, the narrative is there, but I think it's been deeply eroded.
And the curious thing about the Trump years was that on the one hand, he lauded the idea of the dream, and on the other hand, came to power arguing that it had been destroyed.
Hang on. I just have to say here, no, it wasn't achieved at the end of
Oscar,
the
you'll
Second
be in a
World
minute, don't
War.
worry.
I'm okay.
Because when I
I'm
said it
enjoying
depends
this.
who you ask and who is looking, for African Americans, Native Americans, and many other minorities, it was never achieved.
Without a
And
doubt.
actually, it hasn't been eroded in the sense that it was never there in the first place. So they subscribe to the idea of exceptionalism, in my experience, anecdotally speaking, far less so than the kinds of people who were able to benefit at the end of the Second World War.
But let's not get into the Obama years because we get into the weeds. I mean, really, but I mean, there's some very interesting thoughts spring. But I want to bring Oscar in now. Oscar's from the southern part of the Americas, originally, and is a philosophical thinker and a legal thinker. How do you look at the way that America is now seen, the United States, not the Americas, abroad? And what does that tell us about the ideas that Aminatta and Tim in different ways have been laying out?
I'll speak from south of the border.
Sure.
Then. And, let me do so by reading or sharing with you a very brief extract of a poem I read last week for New York online. The Spanish-American War, the Indian Wars, American imperialism, exceptionalism, interventionism, this is poetic inventorism, foreign policy, military history, military operations, military deployments, military bases abroad, 7 in Colombia alone, territorial evolution, manifest destiny, foreign interventions, Pax Americana, American century, America's backyard, Monroe Doctrine, the Platt Amendment, the U.S. invasion of Panama, the first, 1903, the Costa Rican Civil War. Next is Cuba, next is Paraguay, next is Bolivia, the plot against Juan Bosch in 1963, the coup against João Goulart in Brazil, 1964, the coup against Salvador Allende in Chile, 1973, next is Argentina, next is the U.S. invasion of Panama, the second, 1989. The bad poets who abuse words for propaganda business called it Operation Just Cause. Next is the coup against Dilma Rousseff in Brazil a couple of years ago. Next is Bolivia once again a couple of months ago. Now is Colombia, and Venezuela, and Afghanistan, Kabul, Saigon. This is how we see them.
Well, let me ask a rather obvious question of you all. If we accept that there is peculiar energy to America's vision of itself, the United States' vision of itself, which comes from its founding principles. And in one way or another, it's been there, whether it's been betrayed or not in the last 20 years. How has the likely view of the States in the rest of the world changed in the last month? Tim?
Well, let me just frame it this way. As an American who spent the last 30 years working around the world in different countries, trying to help leaders locally imagine what change and peace could look like, the last 5 years, I've focused on the United States.
Yeah.
And a number of leaders from Northern Ireland, South Africa, the Middle East, Central America were telling me 12, 15 years ago, you need to focus in your own country. And I said, yeah, I know we have some profound problems. And sort of like canaries in a coal mine, they said, no, you don't realize how bad things are going in your country. And we need your country to get stabilized because we need a stable American democracy, as imperfect as it is in the world.
And if you didn't believe that then, when you get an outgoing president of the United States saying, and the first of his kind to say this, our election system is corrupt, it's busted, our judges are, for Trump to say, on the one hand, boasting how many judges he's appointed, and then to say the trouble is that the judiciary is politicized, is a curious paradox. But we've seen it all. It's kind of come to a head, hasn't it, in the last 18 months?
Yeah, I've never believed in American exceptionalism. I think the pandemic has shown us there's no such a thing as human exceptionalism, right? The problem with exceptionalism, it's tied to essentialism, that there's a certain unique quality of people that's innate in them that makes them distinct and special. And I think that's one of the biggest hubris of humans, right?
Yeah.
And so I've seen around the world a certain exceptionalism in different countries, how people think of themselves.
Sure.
Those are the narratives that shape a way people think about themselves. And so in the American colonies, when John Winthrop and others came, they needed to create a narrative to justify their occupation, their conquest, their whatever you want to call it. And you're right. Frederick Douglass said, back in the late 19th century, when the 4th of July was being celebrated as American independence, he said, well, that may work for certain people, but not for a lot of us.
African-American campaign.
And so that's always been there. It's never really been a fully formed, functioning, inclusive democracy. And the last thing I'll say is that narrative can only last when it's meaningful. And in my experience, that a lot of Americans, I actually tested a lot of people. I used to teach a course at a couple of universities. Who here knows about American exceptionalism? And this was a school that was not an elite university. And I had explained what that meant.
Yeah.
And the point is, in their lived experience, they never thought of their life experience as Americans to be exceptional in the world. They actually thought it was a struggle. And whether it was a person of color, poor, white, you name it, first generation. And so I thought it was important to recognize that it's not like this deeply felt sense that defines how people see themselves as Americans within and Americans abroad.
If that's true, the question is, what does that portend for the rest of us? Oscar.
Why does that matter today? One additional element. The United States of America, let us not call it America, is the next Latin American country. And demographically speaking, by 2040, you have it. And that's causing a lot of the anxiety that Tim has been referring to as the erosion of the dream. I lived in the south of the United States for 7 years in Texas. And of course, when you're a Latin American in Texas, first thing you realize is that we did not cross the border. The border crossed us.
Yeah. Well, the border used to be up there.
Correct.
I mean,
So
were you
Montana,
but you were in
Spanish
Austin,
War.
presumably. Were you in Austin?
I was in Houston.
Oh, right. Okay.
So that's hugely important in what that means for the Americans that Tim is referring to. Well, for many of them, it means precisely the loss of that narrative and that dream, a dream that wasn't there to begin with.
So let's talk about the consequences of this. You know, we can argue about how it has happened and how we describe it. Where does the, whatever we call it, the loss of the idea of the dream, if that is true, and curiously, that is what Trump argued had happened while he championed the idea that it was something that was still there, which only he could do with his brilliance and insight and peculiar political skill. Aminatta, where does this leave us?
Who's us? I mean, where does it leave America or the world? I don't know. Oh, the rest of the world. You know, I on January the 5th, I sent a text to an American friend of mine, and I said,
The day before the insurrection.
Correct. And I said, are you ready for the coup? And the next day he texted me and said, how on earth did you know? And I said, well, I'm not a proud boy, but, you know, I said, I've seen it before. Okay, I've seen it so many times where I've lived around the world, I've been part of, you know, coups and revolutions. And I said, I've seen it before. And if America was ever exceptional, what's showing that the exceptionalism was never really based on anything is the way in which it's imploding. Yesterday, Elif Shafak talked about liquid and solid countries, didn't she?
Yeah.
And what we're now seeing is what we thought was a solid country or took to be a reasonably solid country is actually a liquid country. And I think that portends very badly for other countries which were solid and which may yet liquefy.
So do you think, I want to go to Tim and ask him what he thought about January 6th, but before I do that, do you think it would be better for the rest of us in, let's call it loosely, the democratic world, if America were solid rather than liquid?
Yes, it would be better because when it becomes liquid, it's going to be terrible.
Tim?
Yeah, I have a good friend of mine who's a journalist. He said to me about 2 months ago that if it wasn't for 24 local Republican officials in December and January, in Ohio, Georgia, and Michigan, Trump would have overturned the election.
Yeah.
And now what's happening is local Republican officials are firing, not reelecting, the people who said no to their president of their party when he was calling them up, inviting them to the White House. Some of them went to the White House. They're now being taken out. And so, you know, this solid state, which has always been a bit jelly, and at moments, it may seem, my point at the end of the Second World War, is that's when the American middle class, for principally white Americans, emerged, was at the end of the Second World War. That's been pretty much over for the last 3 decades. And so now you see white America saying, wait a minute, the democracy or this American dream is no longer there. And now it's under threat by this demographically, culturally changing country.
Yeah, the Latino
And therefore,
population that's increasing.
we don't want that democracy. So we are a multinational, multi-ethnic nation, but we're not a multi-racial and ethnic democracy. And even framing it as that scares a lot of people. And so we're at this existential moment in a way that we are heading into a liquid state that deeply concerns me as an American. And so it's a moment we have to be aware of. And I think we can focus on American exceptionalism and realize this just shows we're not exceptional, because this can happen to anybody around the world, and it has happened.
Well, let me ask a rather basic, practical question here. Trump got 74 million votes. The courts have decided that his claims that the election was fraudulent are
Fraudulent claims.
illusory. Yeah. I mean, Giuliani brought 62 cases, and they were all thrown out at first base, apart from one which got second base and was then thrown out. And Trump then said the Supreme Court was corrupt. But he got 74 million votes. Biden was elected by a squeaker. Is Biden up to addressing this question?
I mean, what's happened in the last 2 weeks has really done major damage to the United States and to this president and this administration. But I do think the legislation that he's passing on infrastructure is going to be the biggest change in American social policy since the New Deal.
It is a new deal. It's a new deal. It's bigger than the Great Society.
And what Ronald Reagan did was one of the most destructive things, was make the federal government look like the enemy to the American people. And
government is not the solution, it's a problem.
And Joe Biden, and it's really out of necessity. It's not that he's come along as FDR and convinced people. I mean, FDR got what he done is because out of necessity. I mean, Herbert Hoover got elected because he was a humanitarian who led the refugee relief program in Europe. Yeah. And when he came home, he was elected as this progressive Republican. But there had been no tradition in American history of a strong federal state doing welfare, social protection. So he just didn't know what to do. And FDR came along and just said, well, we'll figure something out. And he had the confidence of being an American aristocrat. And he brought some really smart people along that he, like Frances Perkins, this woman who was the Secretary of Labor in New York and created some of the best social programs. So he did that and transformed the country. And it was deeply divided, and populists emerged in the United States against FDR. Now we're at a moment, ironically, Joe Biden, who is no Franklin Delano Roosevelt, is actually, because of the moment we're in, the pandemic, the crisis economically, racial reckoning, has created a moment politically where we're going to see, if this all passes, which it seems, is going to fundamentally change the social basis of the economy, which could portend a better day.
Okay, it will, in terms of, school roofs being repaired, bridges, roads,
poverty levels
crumbling, all that stuff. And there will be people who are on the edge who are brought back. But will it solve the question of belief and national identity, which we've decided is up for grabs?
That's a very good question, Jim, because it tells us that we cannot think about the United States of America without thinking about the Americas in the plural. And the Biden administration still needs to tell us what they're going to do about that. The belief, the only way out of the crisis of national identity is to go beyond the nation and to go beyond those borders. That is already collapsing as we have seen. But think about the fact that the protests that we have seen since at least 2019, the BLM, the Black Lives Matter protests, were not American in the sense of exclusively or exceptionally US-based. This is a sequence that includes also the Chilean protests, the protests in Colombia, which are still ongoing. We're not hearing about them anymore. All of those have to do precisely with either the solidity or the liquidity of the support that American governments have given to certain governments in the region. The entire Western Hemisphere is going to change hands next year. There are incredibly important elections, specifically the elections in Brazil, hugely important. But you have elections, you have a constitutional assembly in Chile. you have elections in Colombia. And which means that actually the allies of the sort of conservative side of the US are going to go. That's clear. That's going to change also the way America sees itself and sees its position in the Western Hemisphere. So again, the way out of a crisis of national identities to begin for Americans to begin to think about themselves beyond the nation. Many are already doing that. For instance, Amerindian movements. Amerindians within the US have been writing constitutions recently. For instance, the White Earth Nation, the Anishinaabe Constitution from 2013. Very interesting. Interestingly, they are trying to redefine institutional forms of sovereignty that no longer can be contained within the federal structure. That's the way out, and that portends some very interesting changes for the rest of the world.
Tim, do you believe, when you talk about the difficulties that led many Americans to believe that the idea that every generation will be better than the generation before has died, do you believe that a significant proportion of the population believes that rather than being set on a path of inevitable progress, which is always effectively what the dream is about, that America is now in decline almost irrevocably in the 21st century, that is the story. 20th century was the story of American triumph, industrially, economically, militarily. And that the 21st century, with the rise of China and so on, and authoritarianism, Putin says Western democracy is obsolete, quote unquote, that most Americans are beginning to think that they're on a path of decline?
Yeah, I mean, I am an optimist by nature.
Yes.
And I've spent 30 years in war zones and a lot of places, keeping an optimistic mindset and temperament. The last 4 years of Donald Trump has been a horror. And it challenged every, mediation, negotiation, diplomacy skill. When I had a friend or a family member, thankfully distant family members, who thought that Donald Trump was the best thing since, I thought, FDR, it was really, really difficult. After the election in November, we all thought there'd be a repudiation. There wasn't. 10 million more people voted for this man, and they had no excuse. Then I and my colleagues started looking at what's going on. Because if you take a third to half of the 74 million, many of those people who voted for Trump twice voted for Obama twice.
Yep.
So what is motivating them?
Yep.
It's not like he was running against AOC or Bernie Sanders. He was running against Joe Boring Biden. And what it came to is a deep sense of fear.
Yeah.
And we convened some of the top political scientists and social psychologists who look at these issues. And there's, you don't get much in academia consensus, but they had a huge consensus that what is shaping a lot of this is profound status and identity threat that has been weaponized, particularly from the right, for 50, 60 years. So what is legitimate fear of change?
Yes,
that
Trump didn't invent Trumpism.
Trump is,
I mean,
Trump
he
is the
inherited
beneficiary
it.
of what is legitimate fear of a changing environment.
Yeah.
We're all, as humans, aware of threats to our status. But then when that gets weaponized as grievance, meaning, somebody else is responsible for this. And then what the Republicans have done, there's a great book called It Was All a Lie by Stuart Stevens, who is the mastermind of the last 5 Republican presidential nominees. And he looks at what happened in the last 4 years and said, we created the conditions to blame, to shift blame as we created wealth and concentrated wealth. Well, it wasn't us, right? It's very difficult for Americans brought up in this notion of pulling yourself from the bootstraps to blame people who've created wealth and achieved wealth.
Yeah.
So it's much easier to say, well, then for me to recognize that was a game and not really achievable is to really challenge the very narrative of what this nation was built on and what they were sold. So therefore, it's somebody else's fault. Somebody else is causing this problem.
And the consequence of that is fear and rage. And I think anybody who looks at the serious footage that we've now all got of the January 6th insurrection will come to the conclusion, although it can't be proved, that if Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, had been in her office, she probably would have been killed.
Mike Pence
No
would have been
doubt.
hung.
Yeah.
I mean, the reality is,
I mean,
is
that's
that
that's the level we got to.
that's the
By
thing
that guy
sh-
with the horns.
that was the sort of the, I don't know what, the bridge too far for me was after the election. I was saying in November, we looked at, holy shit, forgive me for saying the word holy, was that that 74 million people just voted for this man.
Yeah.
But then what Trump did between November and January was literally try to overthrow the vote.
Well,
And,
and
he
he-
was
and he-
that close in doing
He
it.
was very
And he
close.
Very,
argued,
very
but he
close.
argued in support of that, aim. He argued that the system was corrupt.
Oh yeah.
I mean, he's the first president in 200 years to argue that the entire basis of the thing in which particularly his more conservative supporters had built their lives, a belief in the Constitution, a belief in the Supreme Court, and all the rest of it, was bollocks.
Yeah, there's a certain paradox, irony that, historically conservatives in the United States believe in structures and institutions and stability and precedent.
Yeah.
They're willing to throw all of that out
Exactly.
to protect not even a democracy anymore. There are recent surveys and research that they're like, yeah, democracy doesn't serve us anymore.
Yeah.
They are embracing authoritarianism
Yeah.
to protect a future that they feel is under threat. And it's
Well, that's why, I mean, his admiration for Putin was such. I mean, he was basically saying, I wish I could behave like you. And the problem is I've got this pesky constitution.
Yeah.
Was essentially what he said.
There's a book everybody should read. I'm sorry. It's called How Democracies Die. I know it's an uplifting, book you read when you're on a yoga trip. But How Democracies Die was written by two professors at Harvard. It came out in 2016. And they're experts on Latin American autocracies.
That's why none of this is a
democracies,
surprise.
Turkey.
None of
elsewhere.
this came as a surprise. to us.
Yeah, none of
Right.
us.
Not
No,
at all.
but what they looked
Not
at,
at all.
is, and they predicted, they said, here are the steps for how they control the media, for the language they use, the particular language they use around, it was
Absolutely.
corrupt, it was this, it was that, and this is what's going to start happening.
Look,
Aminatta.
I once dreamed up a book called The Idiot's Guide to Dictatorship with Fatima Bhutto, and we just, there's a blueprint for
Yeah.
it, right? There's a blueprint, which is why none of us are surprised about what happened on January the 6th. What I wanted to say was, when I listened to Tim talk about Obama and the people who voted for both Obama and Trump, I think the one thing those two men had in common was that they were able to create some sort of new narrative or take hold of a narrative and
Isn't that true of
advance it.
everybody who wins an election?
Hmm?
Isn't that true of everyone who wins an
Probably,
election?
but not so much. They don't. I haven't anyway in America seen that much energy around Obama with "Yes, we can," and then it came up with Trump again. But it's interesting that so many people who voted for Obama were also willing to vote for Trump, and you wouldn't think that was conceivable. So what it seems to me, I'm not as hopeful as Tim. I see a country that is absolutely following the blueprint to decline. And I think to implosion, actually. And I think what it looks like is the FTSE on a bad day, right? When it's going like the jagged red line.
Well-
And we're at the moment just with Biden, where there's been an upswing. But I think generally speaking, the attack on the institutions, the deep fracturing and the way Americans treat each other is simply, to anybody who comes from a liberal Western democracy and is used to people having some sense of responsibility for the other people in the population, it simply doesn't exist in America the way it does elsewhere. So I'm deeply pessimistic about this.
So, if we take that view, what are the consequences for the rest of us? Oscar, you were making the point that you think that in some areas, in Latin America, for example, where there are, right-wing, rather authoritarian figures,
Who inspired Trump? by
that
the
it's
way.
good, indeed, that it's going to change. But if, you would regard that as a hopeful thing, if America is going down the drain, as you suggest, where does it leave the rest of the people who sandwiched between, a melting democracy, as you would put it, in the States, with an authoritarian Russia, with an extremely, aggressive China, who, the most important piece of news, as Willie Dalrymple was saying a few minutes ago, in Afghanistan was that Taliban have done a quite nice deal with China. Right. We've recognized them. Well, of course they have. Big surprise. What's the implication for the rest of us?
There are two choices here. Either we embrace this narrative of decline, and therefore the people who are in between are going to be crushed. Or else we realize that optimism is not just some fanciful thing, but it is a necessity, precisely because otherwise what you have is that kind of crush. Optimism here, of course, is not optimism of the will. It's not pulling oneself from one's bootstraps, but rather institutional reinvention. America needs to reinvent itself and its institutions. There are people within America who are doing that. I gave the example of Amerindians, and I know that most people will think, oh, but that's just a few minoritarian ones. No, of course, it's not just them. It's also African Americans. That's why they are in the streets. The same is happening elsewhere in the hemisphere. And of course, that means that either we find ways to reinvent democracy in a way that not only is more inclusive, but actually does deliver on its economic promise of equality, because that inequality is what lies at the basis of why people who voted for Obama then voted for Trump. They voted for Obama expecting some kind of material victory. People like Trump or like Bolsonaro or like Ibáñez in Bolivia, they know they cannot deliver that material satisfaction. So they create these narratives, these myths, so as to provide emotional victories. But emotions live in that very specific context on masks and illusions. And those masks, like the one that guy was wearing on the 6th of January, fall. So either inequality is solved, either we have a real sort of New Deal, or else the narrative of decline will take place.
Yeah, I mean, I lean lately towards pessimism, but hope for optimism. And some of you may remember my organization does a lot of work with brain and behavioral scientists. And I asked one a few years ago, I said, okay, fear sits in an ancient part of our mammalian brain. Where does hope sit? And it was a really interesting response. She said, hope is a reasoned, rational-based, cognitive sort of imagining of a different future, a better future. Hope is not about, I hope for a negative outcome. You hope for something better. And she said, what that literally means is that more human part of our brain is connecting with the more ancient parts of our brain where fear resides, or at least is experienced, and goes to the memory, goes to the fear areas, and reorganizes them to create a new vision of the future. And it actually is something that happens in our brains. And narratives are core. There's a biological basis for narrative. It's how we organize the world around us, how we organize how we see the world around us. And so hope does spring eternal, to use that phrase, right? And, Oscar probably can quote Gramsci better than I can, but I remember reading many years ago, he often said that between the collapse of the old order and the creation of a new order is where most of the destruction takes place.
Monsters emerge.
And monsters emerge. And we're at that moment. If there's good news, like we heard today about Afghanistan, 60% of the population is under 20.
Yep.
If you look at the demographics in the United States, it is increasingly becoming more diverse.
Yes,
but it's also younger. And I heard over the last day or so, younger generation here are asking questions about big issues, and they're doing it in the United States. People are growing up saying, that's over. We want concrete results.
Well, and
we're going to be active.
The obvious evidence of that is on the environmental question.
Absolutely.
I mean, if you talk to Americans under 40, and particularly under 30, the obsession is with, getting things straight. If you talk to the guts of the Trumpist vote, not all of it, but the guts of it, it's over 40.
And they're dying.
It's white, and they're dying, and it doesn't get... Now, Razia Iqbal, my BBC colleague and very, very familiar figure at Beyond Borders, of course, has been listening to this patiently, remotely, Razia, but she's now got the absolute pleasure, which we would all like, of being able to give us some thunder. What do you make of what you've heard? What do you think?
Hello, everyone. You're hearing me from Cape Cod. So
Nice.
Life is tough.
A place very, very near where the founding fathers landed on Plymouth Rock. It's been so interesting hearing what you've all been saying. And one of the things that I've been thinking about the most listening to you all is this notion of hope, because I do think that hope is power. I do think it gives people power. If you look at what's been happening in Afghanistan in the last 2 to 3 weeks, the loss of hope has left everyone powerless. And I think in America, what astounds me is the notion of hope. And I was thinking, one of you, I think it might have been Tim, mentioned Frederick Douglass. Douglass was this figure who for so long, excoriated American exceptionalism, berated America for having this idea that it was different from the rest of the world. And yet after the Civil War, this unbelievable, agonizing Civil War, towards the end of the 1860s, he embraced the idea of American exceptionalism. He was so interesting in that he turned his view entirely. He talked about it being founded on a government based on justice and recognizing the equal rights of all men. I would have preferred him to have included women in that, obviously. Claiming no higher authority for its existence or sanction for its laws than nature, and the regular ascertained will of the people. And there is something about him changing his mind that makes me feel hopeful about America. I think, Jim, what you were saying about the ascendance of China does make one pause, because it's certainly true that America was at the heart of the success of the 20th century. And I do wonder about the notion that America maybe needs a counter. It needs an enemy. And of course, China, through the eyes of Trump, and to a large extent through the eyes of Biden, you can argue that the mess with Afghanistan was as a result of policymakers and policy wonks in Washington only focusing their minds on China and not on what was happening in the Middle East and not what was happening in Afghanistan. So there is an awful lot about what's happening in America at the moment that gives people cause for despair. But I suppose I feel, because I've been coming here for so long, and also because I've read the culture of America so much, and Aminatta, and I know that you'll probably have lots of things to say about this, but I look at cultural figures such as James Baldwin and Douglas, and even Muhammad Ali, the man who took exception to everything about American exceptionalism, and then became this Muslim who became this icon for Americans. I think it's in figures like that I find some hope, some small hope. I'm not a Pollyanna, but I do find some kind of semblance of hope in things like that.
Well, it's interesting, Raz. I mean, you're on Cape Cod in Massachusetts, which is a place, where you can't walk for more than 2 miles without coming across a name from home, whether it's Plymouth or Sandwich or... Where are you, incidentally?
I'm in Wellfleet.
Oh, well, the oysters are rather good in Wellfleet. Anyway, if you go to New England, and one of the things that all of us have known over the years is the New Hampshire primary, the traditional beginning of the presidential year cycle. And in New Hampshire, that strange state, live free or die, is its motto, the Granite State, which is a curious kind of Yankee cussedness. but a belief in the fundamentals. And, you know, people go to town meetings and they listen to candidates. And if you want to restore your faith in American democracy, it always seems to me, if you go to New England, you find that there's a kind of feeling that all the things that happened in the 17th century and the 18th century are still alive and well. And the question I think we have to address as we come to the close of this, and I want to ask you first, Razia, is that an absolute illusion that is passed away? Or is there still, is there still rattling along, you know, under all this trouble, a belief in those things that will persist?
I think there absolutely is, and that's because the story that America has told itself and has bought hook, line, and sinker for decade after decade, it is that myth of exceptionalism. And the thing about stories is that they are so potent. And the only thing that busts any myth is when you do what Aminatta was talking about right at the beginning, which is try and recast it through the eyes of other people. America needs to start seeing itself the way the rest of the world sees it. And I think, although in New England, you're right, Jim, that there is this real sense of history and a sense of feeling special, all of those things are true. But I also would urge people who are in the audience and who will watch the recording of this, is to read the people who are the outsiders, the Americans, but who are the outsiders. You can do no wrong than start with someone like Baldwin, and who looked at America from afar. And I do think that it's true that here in New England there is a different way of looking at the world. But I also remember covering the 2016 election and being in New Hampshire and finding a man whom he interviewed who was having a tattoo of Donald Trump's face put on the back of his leg. So, there is that too, that, it's not, New Hampshire is not devoid of people who really do not think the way that perhaps everyone in the audience today and on the panel would like to think that they should be thinking.
Indeed, and if you pick up the Manchester Union leader on any other day, you'll find that view strongly expressed. I'll come back to you in a moment, Razia, for a last word, but let's go around. Where do you think this gets us, Oscar? Where have you come to in the last hour?
The best way for people to know where it gets us is to read three American authors. One, Razia, wonderful Razia mentioned already, James Baldwin. The other two, contemporary writers. The Anishinaabe poet Gerald Wiesener. Please read him. And then Natalie Diaz. Natalie Diaz won this year the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry with a collection titled Postcolonial Love Poem written in both Spanish and English and other voices. That new language, let's call it a Spanglish for lack of a better term, that's the future.
Aminatta.
I think America needs a new narrative, and I don't think that exceptionalism is really is strong enough to carry it through the crisis that it currently faces. I think it is right to be hopeful. I think we wouldn't have children, we wouldn't get married, we wouldn't do anything if hope wasn't part of the human spirit. But I think you have to know where you're standing, and you have to look in the mirror, and you have to see, you're not 21 anymore. You're living in a different world. You have to figure out what your new reality looks like. And I think that's what America has to do, has to really look and see what is its new reality and what is the new narrative that can carry it forward into that reality.
I want to come back to you, Tim, at the end as the only American passport holder on the panel. So, Razia, have a last word. Oh, well,
No,
just
joking.
No. Okay, right. Razia.
I don't disagree with what I've just heard at all. I mean, I agree with Oscar, and those people should be read. And Aminatta, I completely agree with you that America needs to rethink. Its ability and capacity to do it is the thing that I think is interesting. And I'm not convinced that it has the capacity, but based on what I read in terms of cultural figures, not necessarily political thinkers, I'm hopeful, because I think it's those people
Well-
who can reshape that story of America.
Well, it's interesting whether artists and poets, thinkers of various kinds, can do it. The trouble is, we are in the grip of politics. There will be midterm elections, believe it or not, in 14 months from now, 15 months from now, where the balance of power on Capitol Hill might shift. There will, of course, be a presidential election in 2024. The president is going to be 80 in November. He's extremely unlikely to run for all kinds of reasons, but that maybe is one of them. So, Tim, in summing up for us, I'd ask you just to reflect on what's been said by your fellow panelists, but also perhaps very briefly to say whether you think that the political process that lies ahead is up to the challenge that it faces.
Well, I think to build off what Aminatta was saying about not being 21 anymore is when you think of forgetting countries and nations, think of individuals. When you're young, you think you're exceptional, right? If you're healthy and so forth, you think, you've got the whole world ahead of you. You're strong, you can do anything you want. Then as you get older, you focus on resilience. And I think the new narrative is not about exceptionalism, it's about resilience. And not just resilient to a changing cultural demographic reality of the country, but the world is fundamentally changing. This pandemic has upset people's ability to predict what's going to happen next week. Are they going to go back to work? Are they going to have a job? Is their family going to be safe? Can they cross the state line, never mind an international border? Resilient in terms of climate change. I mean, whether it's droughts, whether in July in the East Coast of the United States, we had haze all through the Northeast, and they were from the fires in the West Coast. So people are facing the need to be resilient, even if they weren't even thinking of the concept of American exceptionalism. And so I think the narrative is one of how do we be resilient as a nation, as a people? One of the things I've learned work around the world, I remember in the context of Northern Ireland, where one of my great privileges was helping bring Rolf Meyer and Cyril Ramaphosa, who's now president, but were the chief negotiators to Belfast in the early 90s. And I don't know if Jonathan's here, but when the Good Friday Agreement was signed in 1998, I called up Rolf and Cyril and I said, thank you for everything you've done. This is a really historic moment. And they were kind of a downer. And they said, well, we watched the political leaders go to the television and give different interpretations of the peace agreement they just signed. And I said, what do you mean? They said, you can't build a shared future without a shared understanding of where you're coming from. And I think this is the moment for the United States. There's a great Gauguin painting, a triptych, which happens to be in Boston. And it's of these Tahitian women and children. And he wrote in the upper left, who are we? Where are we from? And where are we going?
I have another word for you, another term that might help us, survivance. It was coined by Gerald Wiesener, the poet I just mentioned. Because the problem with resilience is that it might mean just survivance, a lot of victimhood. None of that is helpful. Survivance is a combination between, it's a portmanteau word, combination between survival and resistance and renaissance.
Right.
That is a beautiful term.
The one thing I think we have to be careful of, and I've learned this from people around the world, is that we have to avoid, which I see happening in our country, of falling into binaries. And when you fall into a binary, it's good or bad, yes or no, I'm good, they're evil. And we have to see the world in its complexity. And when you see the world in a complexity, exceptionalism falls away. And I think we have to, the word resistance has become politicized because people say, well, you're resisting the change we want, or you're maintaining the status quo. I think resilience is a process onto something else, to renewal. And it seems to me what we need to do in the United States, and it's again, not unique to the United States, is renew a different contract. We are the reality of a multi-ethnic, multiracial nation. they will be the voters of the future, which is why the Republicans are putting all these regressive voting laws, because they look in their crystal ball and saying 10 or 20 years, we're gone.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that gives me optimism. But I want this younger generation to focus on renewal. Yes, resistance is important to establish, but we need to focus in the future.
Let's
That
agree
hope.
on renewal.
Yeah.
Razia in Wellfleet, have a hot dog from Arthur's for me.
And oysters.
You know what I mean. It's lovely to hear you. Oscar, Aminatta, Tim, the American embodiment
Token
on
American.
the platform. Thank you all
Captain
very,
America.
very much. That was an enthralling hour. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please thank them very much.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you.